I grew up in a house that always felt too loud and yet too quiet at the same time. The laughter, the cheers, the constant chatter, they were never for me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, my homework spread out in front of me while my siblings performed little triumphs that always seemed to shine brighter than anything I could do. My sister brought home awards for spelling bees. My brother came home with medals for football, and my parents' eyes sparkled with pride that somehow never reached me. I was there, physically, present in the photographs and at the dinner table, but invisible, like a shadow that could be ignored without consequence. Every accomplishment I had was met with a shrug or a passing comment, nothing like the fanfare my siblings received. Even the smallest victories, the ones I thought would finally earn me a nod, were overlooked. Birthdays came and went with minimal attention, and achievements outside the family's interest barely registered. I learned quickly that trying to compete for their recognition was exhausting, even futile. Yet, it wasn't always resentment that filled me. It was confusion. Why was I never enough? What made my presence seem less important? I watched them so closely, memorizing the way my parents' faces lit up for them, hoping to understand the invisible standard I could never reach. The contrasts were sharp, almost cruel. The loud laughter at a sibling's story, my quiet attempts at conversation fading into the background. It was as though the world in that house was designed to celebrate everyone but me. Still, I began to notice subtle patterns, little glimpses of the family's priorities, the rules they followed without ever saying them out loud. I learned to observe, to listen, to understand the dynamics that left me on the outside. I couldn't change their favoritism, but I could learn its shape, its rhythm. That silent study became my armor, a quiet determination I didn't yet fully recognize. Even in my loneliness, small sparks of defiance began to form. If no one else would see me, I would see myself. If they refused to celebrate me, I would celebrate the parts of me they ignored. Those early wounds, the feeling of being the overlooked, the forgotten, the black sheep, planted a seed that would quietly grow, unnoticed at first, until one day it would bloom into something no one could ignore. The house that had once felt suffocating began to feel like a classroom, harsh but instructive. I watched, I learned, I stored every slight, every word, every moment of exclusion. I didn't understand it fully then, but I knew it mattered. I wasn't just surviving, I was quietly preparing, collecting strength from the very indifference that had once wounded me so deeply. Looking back now, I see those years not only as a time of invisibility, but as the beginning of a quiet revolution inside myself. I may have been unseen, unheard, dismissed, but inside, I was becoming someone who would not remain powerless forever. And though I didn't know it yet, those early days of exclusion were the first steps toward a life that my family could never control, a life where I would finally be the one they couldn't ignore. Every day felt like a series of tiny blows, the kind that barely left a mark on the outside but sank deep into your bones. I remember dinners where my words drifted into the air, unheard, as if they had been swallowed by the hum of conversation around me. I would tell a story, hoping for a smile or even a nod, but my parents' eyes would glaze over, already focused on my siblings, laughing at jokes I didn't hear or cheering for accomplishments I didn't know existed. It wasn't overt cruelty, not always, but the message was clear. My presence didn't matter. Birthdays were the worst. Mine were muted affairs, sometimes forgotten entirely, celebrated only with a perfunctory gift that seemed more like a formality than an acknowledgement. Meanwhile, my siblings' birthdays were orchestrated with fanfare, balloons, banners, parties with friends and relatives who came to applaud them. Each forgotten detail, each overlooked effort, became a scar etched into my sense of self. I began to understand that love in my family was conditional, dispensed unevenly, favoring those who fit some invisible mold. School projects, performances, even small achievements outside the home were treated the same way. When I brought home good grades or won minor competitions, the recognition was fleeting, a passing good job at most, while my siblings' successes were documented, praised, and displayed for all to see. The contrast was constant, almost cruel in its predictability. Every overlooked victory reinforced a bitter lesson. I was never enough for them, no matter how hard I tried. I started to notice patterns, little indicators that this wasn't random neglect, but a system of favoritism. My sister, always charming and articulate, seemed to know exactly how to catch their attention. My brother, athletic and outgoing, had a natural spotlight around him. And me? I was quiet, earnest, the one who followed rules without question, but never seemed to earn applause. The injustice wasn't loud, it was quiet, persistent, and relentless, like water eroding stone. Even friends who came over noticed. "Why does your brother get all the praise?" they would ask. I shrugged, unsure how to answer, because I didn't want to admit that the pain had become normal, that being overlooked was my everyday reality. Yet inside, a slow burn of frustration and longing began to grow. I didn't just want recognition, I wanted to be seen, to matter, to have my presence acknowledged as more than background noise. These micro-betrayals piled up, forming a narrative I couldn't yet articulate. Every overlooked effort, every forgotten birthday, every silent dinner conversation whispered the same thing. I was the family's afterthought. And as much as it hurt, it also opened my eyes. I realized that favoritism wasn't accidental. It was intentional, embedded in the family's way of being. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a design I had been forced to navigate. And slowly I began to understand its rules. By the time I was a teenager, I had become hyper-aware, cataloging each slight, each omission, each moment where I was dismissed. The constant contrast, my siblings celebrated, my efforts ignored, was teaching me more than humiliation. It was teaching me strategy. If they refused to see me, I would learn to see them, to notice patterns, to anticipate weaknesses, to survive in a system that seemed determined to erase me. The scars were small but cumulative, shaping me into someone who would learn to turn invisibility into observation, neglect into insight, and exclusion into quiet preparation for something greater. In our house, the hierarchy was obvious to anyone who bothered to notice. My siblings were the golden children, the ones who seemed to glide through life on a cushion of constant approval and resources. Every achievement, no matter how small, was met with celebration. Awards, trophies, extracurricular opportunities, they were handed out with ease, as if the world had been waiting just for them. My parents' eyes would light up at their names, their voices filled with excitement whenever they spoke. Meanwhile, I was the background, the observer, the one whose successes were barely noted, whose failures were quietly tolerated without fanfare. Birthdays were the clearest example. My brother would receive elaborate parties with themed decorations, gifts he had wished for weeks in advance, and relatives who came to shower him with attention. My sister's milestones were chronicled in photo albums, every recital, every certificate carefully framed or displayed. And me? A modest cake, perhaps. A card hastily signed, a gift that felt like it had been grabbed off the shelf in passing. The message was unspoken but clear. I was not the focus, not the priority, not the one worth investing in. It wasn't just gifts, it was opportunities. My siblings were enrolled in classes, camps, and experiences designed to maximize their potential. Music lessons, sports teams, summer programs, they were cultivated carefully, while my own requests were met with delay, dismissal, or a vague, "we'll see." The contrast was jarring. Their successes were nurtured, their ambitions funded, their mistakes excused because they were worth it. I, on the other hand, learned early that effort alone would not translate into recognition. Even my best attempts were discounted, my potential underestimated, my mistakes remembered. The disparity created a constant tension in the household. I watched my siblings move through life like favored royalty, doors opening for them at every turn. Their triumphs were celebrated loudly, their missteps forgiven with ease, their needs anticipated before they even voiced them. And me? I had to fight silently for scraps of attention, to justify my existence in a family that seemed to measure love by success and visibility. Every birthday, every award, every compliment they received reinforced a hierarchy that was brutally clear. Began to question the rules of love and attention in our home. Was it possible to be loved and still unseen? Was admiration conditional, reserved only for those who fit a certain mold. The inequality gnawed at me, not just as a child, but as a developing person learning to understand worth. I watched their rise, admired at a distance, and slowly realized that the same hands that held me back had built up others with deliberate care. It was not randomness, it was strategy, and I had been left out of the equation. Even as a child, I started keeping mental records: who received what, when, and how often. The patterns were undeniable. The golden children had everything I didn't: resources, praise, love. They flowed freely to them, while I navigated scarcity, neglect, and oversight. It was a cruel contrast, and it shaped my view of the world. I understood that love in my family came with conditions. Performance mattered, charm mattered, visibility mattered. And if I didn't fit the mold, I was left to carve my own path through shadows. Yet, beneath the pain, a seed of determination began to take root. I may not have had gifts, opportunities, or applause, but I had observation. I learned to notice not just what was given, but why, to see the structures that elevated my siblings while leaving me behind. The golden children shone brightly, but their brilliance exposed the unfairness of the system. And in that realization, I found a strange sort of power. The knowledge that if I understood the rules, if I watched, if I learned, one day I might rewrite them for myself. I still remember the first time I dared to believe in myself. I was 12, brimming with excitement over a school science project I had poured my heart into. I had stayed up late for weeks, sketching designs, testing experiments, and imagining the moment I would proudly present it. I ran into the kitchen one evening, project in hand, hoping to share it with my parents. Their eyes barely lifted from their newspapers, offering a distracted, "That's nice, dear," before returning to their world. My siblings, noticing my enthusiasm, couldn't resist. "Really? That thing? Looks like a mess," my brother sneered, laughing as my sister smirked in agreement. The words hit me harder than any physical blow could. Their laughter, casual and unrestrained, echoed in the room, drowning out the pride I had felt moments before. My voice faltered when I tried to explain my work, my carefully considered ideas dismissed as childish nonsense. My parents offered no defense, no reassurance, only a subtle glance away, as though to signal, "We expected nothing else from you." I carried the project to my bedroom, hoping at least solitude would offer some comfort. But the ridicule lingered, following me in the quiet corners of my mind. It wasn't just the mockery, it was the realization that my family had no interest in my efforts, no belief in my potential. Every careful plan, every spark of ambition, was met with derision. I had hoped to share my joy, but instead I was reminded that my successes were never meant to matter. The incident wasn't a one-time event. It became a pattern. Art projects, essays, small competitions, anything I tried to accomplish outside the narrow scope of what my family deemed important was either ignored or belittled. Meanwhile, my siblings' efforts were celebrated, magnified, displayed proudly for all to see. The contrast was stark, almost cruel. Ambition met with ridicule, while mediocrity or charm was rewarded with attention. It was a lesson I learned, far too young. Visibility and praise were not earned equally. I felt a strange combination of shame and defiance brewing inside me. Shame, because I longed for validation from the people who mattered most in my life. Defiance, because I realized that their approval might never come, no matter what I achieved. That realization marked a turning point. If I wanted to feel pride, if I wanted to nurture my own ambition, I would have to do it for myself, without counting on their recognition. My dreams would survive only if they became my private victories first, unseen and untouchable by their judgment. I began to work quietly, building skills and knowledge in secret, refusing to announce my efforts until I was ready. Each small success was a personal triumph, a way to reclaim the confidence they had tried to erode. The more I achieved on my own, the clearer it became that dependence on family validation was a trap. I didn't need applause from people who couldn't see my worth. I needed belief in myself. That internal promise became my shield. I would never give anyone the power to define my value again. Even though the sting of mockery lingered for years, it fueled a quiet determination. I learned to embrace my ambitions, to nurture them like delicate seedlings in a storm. Their laughter, their dismissive words, their selective attention. These became reminders not of my weakness, but of the strength I would cultivate in the shadows. I might have been overlooked, ridiculed, or dismissed, but each moment of injustice quietly steeled me, shaping a resolve that would one day transform into unstoppable force. By the time I reached my teens, I understood a simple but powerful truth. If I relied on my family's approval, I would always falter. If I relied on my own belief, I could soar, no matter how invisible I was to them. That early heartbreak, the crushing of my dreams by the people who were supposed to nurture them, planted the seeds for a resilience and independence that would carry me far beyond the confines of their limited vision. And in that private vow, I began building the foundation for a life that no one could dismiss. After so many small defeats, I discovered the one tool that would protect me better than any argument or explanation: silence. I learned to keep my thoughts to myself, to hold back the excitement, the ideas, the opinions that had so often been met with mockery or dismissal. While my siblings claimed the center of attention effortlessly, their voices loud and demanding, I retreated to corners of the house, to the spaces where my presence would barely register. At first, it felt like surrender, a painful concession to the unfair rules that governed our home. Family dinners became exercises in invisibility. I would sit, listening, nodding occasionally, saying only the bare minimum to avoid attention. My siblings dominated conversation, their voices brimming with confidence and entitlement. My parents leaned in toward them, laughing, encouraging, praising. I learned the rhythm. Interjecting was dangerous, speaking too loudly invited ridicule, and being seen carried a price I was not willing to pay. Silence was safer. It became my shield against humiliation, my way to navigate a world that consistently told me I didn't belong. At first, it was lonely. I longed to join in, to argue, to assert myself, but every attempt had ended in embarrassment. So I withdrew. I began to observe instead of participating, watching the patterns, the subtle favors, the unspoken rules that guided my family's interactions. I took careful mental notes: which behaviors earned praise, which questions would be dismissed, which efforts would go unnoticed. In retreating from their attention, I was not surrendering completely. I was learning. My silence was no longer just a shield, it was a strategy. I noticed the way my siblings manipulated attention without realizing it. My sister had a charm that made everything she said seem brilliant, while my brother's boldness made even mistakes feel like triumphs. Meanwhile, my parents' love seemed transactional, dispensed according to a hidden measure of worth, and me? I faded into the background, but my eyes absorbed every detail, cataloging every slight, every favoritism, every laugh directed at anyone but me. This quiet observation became a weapon I didn't yet fully understand. Friends outside the family often wondered why I seemed so reserved. "Why don't you speak up?" they asked. The answer was simple but invisible. Speaking up had always led to humiliation. Silence, on the other hand, allowed me to exist without being torn down. And in that invisibility, I discovered a strange empowerment. I could learn, prepare, and plan without interference. Every dismissal, every overlooked achievement, every ignored opinion became part of a mental map of my family's weaknesses and blind spots. Over time, the loneliness shifted. Silence no longer felt like surrender. It became a form of control. I learned that retreating from direct conflict didn't mean I had no power. I had more than they realized. The power to watch, to analyze, to understand the dynamics that shaped our household. I could predict reactions, anticipate moves, and perhaps one day use the knowledge they had unknowingly handed me. By my teenage years, I had perfected the art of invisibility. I spoke only when necessary, laughed when required, but otherwise existed quietly, accumulating insight and patience. While my siblings commanded the room with entitlement, I gathered information. While they were celebrated and spoiled, I cultivated an inner understanding of what it meant to survive and endure. My silence, born of injury, had grown into an instrument of self-preservation, and later, strategy. Looking back now, I realized that what felt like weakness at the time was actually the beginning of a subtle form of empowerment. Silence allowed me to survive in a family that had taught me over and over that I didn't belong. It shielded me from humiliation, protected my budding self-worth, and, perhaps most importantly, gave me the clarity to see the system from the outside. And in that clarity, I began to understand that the quietest observer often holds the most power, a truth that would shape every move I made in the years to come. There comes a moment when silence is no longer enough, when the weight of neglect, mockery, and dismissal crushes something deep inside, demanding acknowledgement. For me, that moment arrived one evening that began like any other, but ended with a humiliation I could never forget. My parents had invited extended family over for dinner, a rare occasion meant to celebrate my brother's latest achievement. I had quietly prepared a small project of my own, hoping to show initiative and perhaps earn a fleeting nod. Instead, everything went terribly wrong. As I set my work on the table, my brother smirked and leaned over to whisper something in front of everyone. "Look at this. Honestly, who even cares? It's nothing compared to what I've done." My sister joined in, laughing loudly, ensuring everyone heard. I tried to speak, to explain the effort I had put into it, but my parents' eyes were already rolling, their smiles tight, almost apologetic to the guests, as if my attempt at recognition was an inconvenience. Their words cut deeper than my siblings. Cruelty. "Maybe focus on something you can actually succeed at," my mother said, her tone sweet yet scathing. The sting of that moment wasn't just in the laughter or dismissal. It was in the realization that the people who were supposed to protect and nurture me had fully sided against me. My own family had become conspirators in my humiliation. The guests laughed politely, not out of malice but from the social instinct, to follow the family's lead, leaving me exposed and small in the center of the room. The contrast was unbearable. My siblings, glowing with attention and approval, while I felt like a shadow pressed against the wall, invisible, voiceless, diminished. As I withdrew from the table, tears stinging my eyes, something inside me shifted. It wasn't despair anymore. It was outrage. The quiet endurance, the years of observing, surviving, and fading into the background had prepared me for this moment. I realized that no amount of silence, no amount of obedience or effort would earn me their validation. I was powerless only if I allowed myself to remain so. The lesson was brutal but clear. If I wanted respect, recognition, or even a sense of dignity, I would have to claim it on my own terms. That night I retreated to my room and allowed myself a single, unguarded moment of grief. I let the anger and humiliation wash over me fully, acknowledging the depth of the betrayal. I felt the cumulative weight of years, every ignored birthday, every belittled accomplishment, every invisible effort, pressing down. But even in that vulnerability, a spark of resolve ignited. I vowed silently, fiercely, that I would never again allow anyone to define my worth or dictate my possibilities. The powerless role was over. From that moment forward, I would chart my own path. The next days were filled with a strange mixture of lingering hurt and newfound determination. I began to see my family through a sharper lens, recognizing patterns of favoritism, manipulation, and neglect that I had long internalized. Their cruelty was intentional, calculated in ways small and large, and I no longer needed their permission to validate my own identity. The moment of betrayal became a catalyst, transforming years of quiet endurance into deliberate action. Even as I continued to navigate the house that had once felt like a prison, I felt an invisible shift inside me. I was no longer the timid, overlooked child. I was someone who had touched the bottom of humiliation and decided, with unwavering certainty, that I would rise above it. The breaking point was not just a moment of pain. It was a moment of awakening. And in that awakening, I began to see the first glimpses of the power I had been cultivating silently for years, ready to emerge in a way my family would never anticipate. From that night onward, every slight, every mockery, every ignored effort became a building block. The humiliation I had suffered was no longer merely a wound. It was fuel. And as I prepared to step beyond their control, I began to understand the unspoken truth of my existence. If they had always underestimated me, that only meant my eventual rise would be all the more devastating and all the more satisfying. The day I left home was both terrifying and liberating. I packed a small bag, my few belongings carefully chosen, each piece a symbol of the life I was determined to claim for myself. My family barely noticed my departure. My mother offered a dismissive, "Good luck, you'll need it," while my sibling smirked as if I were chasing an impossible dream. The familiar mix of ridicule and indifference followed me to the doorstep, but for the first time, it no longer held power over me. Stepping out felt like breaking through invisible chains, leaving behind the house that had always measured my worth against the impossible standards of others. The real world was nothing like home, both harsher and fuller. I took small jobs at, first, cafes, delivery work, office temp positions, anything that allowed me to stand on my own 2 feet. Every morning was a battle of willpower, learning schedules, navigating bosses, dealing with coworkers who didn't care about my past, my failures, or my family. For the first time, the rules were not pre-written by people who deemed me unworthy. I discovered that my efforts mattered only insofar as I put them in, and slowly, I began to feel the strange, empowering sensation of control. Contrast was everywhere. My family had labeled me a failure, a child who would never amount to anything, whose quiet nature was evidence of weakness. Yet in the streets, in offices, in small apartments far from the world that had ignored me, I was learning resilience. Each paycheck I earned, each problem I solved, each small success I celebrated quietly in my own space became proof that I could survive, and even thrive, without their approval. The humiliation I had endured at home lost its edge when compared to tangible independence. I was no longer living under the weight of judgment. I was building myself in silence, brick by brick. I began to notice strengths that had gone unrecognized for years. Patience, once mistaken for weakness, became a strategic advantage in every job. Observation, honed from years of watching my family, allowed me to anticipate challenges and solve problems before anyone else even noticed. My meticulous nature, once mocked as overly cautious, became an asset in managing responsibilities and earning the trust of employers. I realized that the qualities my family had dismissed as flaws were in fact my secret arsenal, tools that would eventually distinguish me in ways they could never imagine. Friendships formed slowly but meaningfully. People who saw me for who I was rather than who I had been in a home obsessed with hierarchy. Unlike my family, these connections were reciprocal, encouraging, and supportive. Every shared laugh, every small acknowledgement from a friend or colleague reinforced the truth I had begun to understand. My worth did not need validation from those who had consistently denied it. I was capable, competent, and, most importantly, free to define success on my own terms. Freedom was not easy. Independence demanded effort and persistence. I faced setbacks, jobs that didn't last, mistakes that cost me hours or money. But each failure was a lesson, a way to refine my resilience. I began to understand that growth often comes in discomfort, that empowerment is earned through struggle. And through it all, the contrast between my quiet, determined life and the spoiled, entitled world I had left behind sharpened my sense of purpose. Leaving the cage was not just a physical act of walking out the door. It was a psychological liberation. For the first time, I felt that I could chart my own path, define my own goals, and measure my success by standards I created. The world beyond my family's home was neither perfect nor easy, but it was mine. And in claiming it, I discovered a strength they had never allowed me to see. Those first steps toward independence marked the beginning of a journey that would eventually elevate me far beyond their judgment and control. And as I began to embrace the challenges of the outside world, I realized something profound. The life I was building in the shadows, away from their ridicule, was teaching me lessons that home never could. I was learning not only how to survive, but how to thrive. And within that quiet, unseen work, I started discovering the skills, instincts, and determination that my family had never bothered to notice. qualities that would one day make them regret underestimating me. The outside world was harsher than I had imagined, but it was also honest in a way my family never had been. There were no invisible hierarchies favoring charm or favoritism. Merit, effort, and adaptability mattered. Every challenge, every obstacle became a lesson in resilience. I learned quickly that mistakes were not humiliation. They were opportunities to grow, to refine strategy, to prepare for the next challenge. Each day was a classroom, each failure a teacher, each small success a building block for something larger. Mentors appeared in unexpected places. A manager who recognized my meticulous attention to detail taught me the importance of patience and persistence. A coworker who struggled yet never quit showed me that determination could overcome natural talent. These individuals, strangers at first, became guides in a world that demanded skill and resilience. I absorbed lessons like a sponge, combining practical knowledge with the emotional strength I had cultivated through years of family neglect. The contrast was striking. While my siblings had been handed opportunities without effort, I had to earn every inch, and in doing so, I became stronger, sharper, more disciplined. Life outside my family was not easy. I juggled multiple jobs, endured long hours, and faced setbacks that would have crushed me in the past. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to undo progress, moments when I wondered if my efforts were enough. But I learned to see struggle as training, a crucible that shaped both skill and character. The very adversity I had feared became the forge for resilience. While others may have been coddled or protected, I was learning the art of self-reliance, of problem-solving under pressure, and of turning obstacles into stepping stones. Every interaction, every assignment, every challenge became an opportunity to sharpen instincts that had lain dormant under years of neglect. I learned negotiation, observation, and strategic thinking, not the shallow performative skills my siblings relied on, but deep, practical tools that could create real impact. I discovered the value of patience, of timing, of understanding the hidden dynamics that drive human behavior. These lessons, often subtle and unspoken, began to accumulate, forming a foundation I knew would someday allow me to rise far beyond my family's limited vision. More importantly, I learned the importance of self-validation. In the outside world, recognition was earned through effort, results, and consistency. Unlike home, where favoritism skewed perception and diluted merit, here the rules were fair, measurable, and actionable. Every small victory became a source of genuine pride, every accomplishment proof that I was capable. Confidence was no longer dependent on approval. It came from mastery, from evidence, from repeated success. The empowerment I felt was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the invisibility I had endured for so long. Through these lessons, I began to see patterns not just in work or life, but in people. I noticed how ambition, when coupled with strategy and patience, could yield far more than inherited privilege or charm. I recognized how others faltered under pressure because they had never faced real hardship, and I understood that my endurance had given me an advantage no one could take away. The cumulative effect of these experiences was profound. Each struggle, each mentor, each long day of effort was quietly aligning me with something far bigger than any single job or small success. By the end of each week, I felt a subtle shift within myself. I was no longer just surviving. I was learning, evolving, preparing. The lessons were not abstract. They were living, breathing, practical. They were shaping me into someone capable of handling complexity, of navigating systems, of turning adversity into opportunity. The discipline, the insight, and the resilience I gained outside my family's shadow were setting the stage for a transformation that even I could not fully imagine yet. I began to understand that my past, filled with exclusion and ridicule, had been a training ground. Combined with the lessons from the outside world, it had forged skills, intuition, and patience that could not be taught in classrooms or inherited through favoritism. Each struggle, each setback, each small triumph added a layer of readiness, preparing me for a moment when all these lessons would converge, and slowly I started to sense that the life I was quietly building was aligning towards something larger, A future that would not only fulfill my ambitions, but surpass the narrow expectations my family had imposed. The spark came unexpectedly, in a moment that felt ordinary at first, but carried the weight of possibility. I was delivering packages one rainy afternoon, soaked to the bone, when I struck up a conversation with a client, a small business owner who noticed my careful attention to detail and asked if I had ever thought about managing or running my own projects. Her question lingered long after I left, planting an idea that had never taken root before. What if I could create something entirely of my own? What if I didn't have to rely on anyone's permission, validation, or approval? For the first time, ambition wasn't just a dream I nurtured in secret. It felt tangible, achievable. I realized that the skills I had been honing, discipline, patience, observation, and resilience, could be leveraged to build more than just survival. They could be used to construct opportunities, enterprises, even a life that my family would never anticipate. The thought was intoxicating, a sudden shift from endurance to vision. I imagined projects, businesses, or paths that had been impossible to consider, while under the constant shadow of judgment at home. The contrast between my old life and this new possibility was staggering. At home, I had been the quiet one, the failure, the invisible child constantly overlooked while my siblings thrived. Here, I realized that my quiet nature was an asset. It allowed me to observe, to learn, to plan without distraction. My so-called weaknesses were in fact tools I could use to create something lasting. The injustice of the past became fuel. The scars of exclusion became a map for opportunity. For the first time, the life I had been building in secrecy converged. With a tangible vision for the future, I began to experiment cautiously. Small projects, modest investments of time and energy, each tested my skills and expanded my confidence. I reached out to mentors, researched business opportunities, and slowly sketched plans for something I could call my own. Unlike before, when failure had felt like humiliation, now it was information, a way to refine strategy and sharpen judgment. I felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced before, energized by the challenge, excited by possibility, and quietly thrilled at the thought that I could finally define success on my own terms. Meanwhile, my family remained oblivious. They still assumed I was floundering, stuck in dead-end jobs or living a life of inconsequence. I received passing remarks about my lack of direction, comments meant to diminish, yet they could not see the quiet, deliberate work I was doing. Their underestimation became a secret advantage. They had no idea that while they were mocking or ignoring me, I was laying the foundation for a life they would eventually envy. The disparity between perception and reality was empowering. What they dismissed as nothing was, in fact, the birth of everything. The more I pursued this spark, the clearer my purpose became. Each small success reinforced the possibility that I could build something real, something enduring, something that required neither their permission nor their approval. I began to dream in broader terms. A business, a network, a reputation founded entirely on my effort and vision. For the first time, ambition felt achievable not as an abstract fantasy, but as a path paved with concrete actions, skills, and relationships. Every day brought lessons in growth. I learned to manage risk, to anticipate challenges, and to turn small wins into momentum. The quiet patience I had cultivated during years of exclusion transformed into strategic thinking. My resilience became a buffer against uncertainty. I was no longer surviving. I was designing, building, and preparing to claim a future that had once seemed impossible. The spark of ambition had ignited a fire, and for the first time I felt a sense of unstoppable purpose. By the end of that season, I knew one truth with certainty. My family's perception of me as nothing was both false and irrelevant. Their dismissal, their underestimation, had allowed me the freedom to cultivate skills, vision, and determination without interference. I was no longer a shadow in their world. I was a creator in my own. That spark, small at first, had grown into a guiding light, illuminating a path toward independence, growth, and eventually, a life they could never have imagined me achieving. And so, while they continued living in their predictable patterns of entitlement and favoritism. I began quietly constructing something real, an existence built on my own merit, guided by my own ambition, and fueled by the very neglect that had once sought to diminish me. The difference between the life I was leaving behind and the one I was building could not have been more stark, and for the first time, I felt truly powerful in my own right. I had learned that the world rewarded action, not excuses. Every day, I dedicated myself to building something that no one at home could understand or dismiss. Early mornings became my sacred hours, late nights a laboratory for ideas, each moment carefully invested in a future that was entirely mine. While my siblings spent money on luxuries, parties, and indulgences, I invested in tools, courses, and experiences that sharpened my skills and expanded my opportunities. Their world was loud, frivolous, and immediate. Mine was quiet, disciplined, and strategic. Work became ritual. I treated each task, small contracts, freelance projects, or early business experiments, as a chance to learn, refine, and build credibility. Mistakes were analyzed, lessons extracted, improvements implemented. Unlike my family, who measured success in applause and recognition, I measured it in progress, competence, and sustainable growth. My small victories were private but monumental, a slow accumulation of evidence that I could not be ignored forever. Every hour spent, every challenge faced, every failure absorbed without complaint was stacking into something far larger than what anyone around me could imagine. The contrast was stark. I watched my siblings blow through opportunities, spending without thought, trusting charm and entitlement to carry them. They assumed the world would bend to them, while I learned that every gain required careful planning, patience, and perseverance. Their extravagance and mismanagement became a silent motivator, a constant reminder that their successes were often hollow, while my careful work had substance, foundation, and longevity. In the shadows, I was quietly constructing the scaffolding for a future that would eventually eclipse theirs. There were days when doubt crept in, whispers from old fears echoing in my mind. Could I really succeed? Was this all worth the solitude, the sacrifice, the relentless grind? But each small triumph, an unexpected contract, a successful presentation, a positive client review, answered that question. Progress, tangible and undeniable, became a source of quiet satisfaction. I didn't need validation from the people who had consistently undervalued me. Every step forward was a reminder that I was in control of my own destiny, independent of their opinion. Family interactions continued as they always had, blissfully unaware of the work I was doing. They asked occasional questions about my career, but their curiosity was half-hearted, dismissive, assuming I was still floundering. I answered politely, offering vague updates, letting them believe what they wanted, that I was insignificant, unsuccessful, or failing. In reality, I was laying the groundwork for a future they could never anticipate. The disparity between perception and reality became one of my greatest advantages. Their underestimation shielded me from interference and critique. I also noticed that building in silence taught me discipline beyond business. Patience, resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional control became second nature. I could anticipate challenges, understand human behavior, and navigate complex situations with precision. Skills that had been invisible or dismissed at home were now proving indispensable. My quiet persistence was transforming into momentum, subtle but unstoppable, and with each passing month, the gap between my potential and my family's perception of me widened. The thrill of creation, the quiet accumulation of progress, became addictive. I began to see that success was not an event, but a process, a series of deliberate steps taken consistently over time. The small projects, the meticulous planning, the late nights of research, all of it was converging into something real, tangible, and powerful. And yet, outwardly, I remained unseen, underestimated, and underestimated. Still the black sheep in their eyes. That invisibility, once a curse, had become my greatest asset. I could experiment, fail, adapt, and grow without the constraints of judgment or interference. The underdog narrative was not just a story, it was my strategy. I was building quietly, strategically, deliberately, while my family squandered opportunity and remained blind to the forces quietly accumulating in the background. And as the months turned into years, the first hints of recognition began to appear. A client praised my work, a small project exceeded expectations, a door I had carefully nudged open started to swing wider. Yet my family remained blissfully unaware, still entrenched in their assumptions that I was floundering, still blind to the fact that the quiet one, the overlooked one, was rising steadily toward a future they could not even imagine. The first taste of real success hit me like a shockwave. It wasn't flashy or sudden, no headlines, no applause, but it was mine. A small contract I had nurtured for months finally turned into a steady stream of work. A client referred me to another, and another, until the effort I had poured in silently began to yield tangible results. For the first time, I felt the sweet validation of independence, money in my account that I had earned, recognition for my skills that I didn't need to beg for, proof that my work mattered. And yet, it was not entirely sweet. The absence of my family's acknowledgement left a hollow spot that no success could fill. I remembered the dinners where my voice had gone unheard, the birthdays they forgot, the ridicule that had followed every attempt to shine. I had achieved something real, something lasting, but I was doing it alone. There was pride, certainly, but also a pang of loneliness. A reminder that the people who should have been my first supporters remained oblivious, still assuming I was insignificant. The victory felt twice as bright and twice as isolating. I quickly learned that independence comes with a strange duality. On one hand, I was free from judgment and favoritism, able to build according to my own rules. On the other, the absence of familiar recognition, the parental praise, the nods from siblings, created a subtle ache, a longing that lingered despite my accomplishments. I began to understand that empowerment was not simply the absence of oppression, it was also the conscious acceptance of solitude. Success had a taste that was not purely sweet, it was complex, layered with memory and longing. But the tangible proof of progress was undeniable. I could pay my bills, invest in tools for my projects, and plan for growth in ways I never could have imagined while under my family's control. Every dollar earned, every positive feedback, every successful project was a testament to my effort, skill, and resilience. The contrast between the life I had been building and the one my family assumed I was living grew more pronounced each day. I had taken what they considered nothing and turned it into opportunity, while they remained blind to my ascent. The solitude also allowed me to savor every victory on my own terms. I didn't need applause or approval. I needed only the quiet, knowledge that I was capable, that my hard work was producing real results, and that my life was no longer dictated by people who had once dismissed me. Yet I could not escape the subtle conflict within me. The empowerment was intoxicating, but the loneliness was persistent. I realized that success without acknowledgement from the people who had caused so much pain would always carry a bittersweet edge. It was during these months of quiet triumph that I first noticed the shift in perception from the outside world. Clients, colleagues, and mentors began to recognize me for the skill and consistency I had cultivated. Word spread about my work, and opportunities multiplied. I could feel momentum building, a sense of inevitability that what I was creating could not be ignored indefinitely, and yet, my family remained unaware, living in the comfortable illusion that I was floundering, their blindness making my success feel like a secret weapon. That secrecy, though, only heightened the eventual thrill. I realized that the absence of acknowledgement from them made my victories entirely my own. I had created something of value without their interference or influence, a life built in the shadows that now had substance and meaning. The empowerment was real, even if bittersweet, and it reminded me that the past, the ridicule, neglect, and invisibility was no longer a chain but a fuel source propelling me forward. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, I noticed it. My family starting to take note. A passing comment from my mother, a subtle glance from my father, my siblings asking vague questions about my work. The shift was tentative, hesitant, but unmistakable. They were beginning to see cracks in the assumptions they had held for years, beginning to realize that the quiet one they had dismissed was no longer invisible. And that recognition, though faint, was the prelude to a reckoning that was quietly building, one that I had been preparing for all along. The first taste of success had been complex, a mix of pride, empowerment, solitude, and lingering longing, but it had also set the stage for the next phase of the journey. My family's sudden awareness was both a warning and a signal. The world I had built in silence was no longer hidden. The question now was how I would use this newfound position, and whether the years of neglect and exclusion would finally be repaid in ways that were long overdue. The first knock on my door was almost surreal. After years of silence, neglect, and dismissal, it was my family on the other side, asking for help. My heart raced, not with fear, but with disbelief. The same people who had ignored my birthdays, dismissed my efforts, and ridiculed my ambitions, now stood seeking assistance, as if the past had never happened. My mother's voice, trembling slightly, asked for guidance with a financial matter. My brother, usually brash and entitled, hesitated as if trying to hide the awkwardness of his request. My sister smiled nervously, careful not to overstep. The contrast was staggering, from constant superiority to tentative dependence. I remembered everything. The dinners where I was invisible, the projects mocked, the opportunities denied. Each slight, each humiliation, came rushing back like a storm. And yet they were here now, turning to me as though I had always been the expert, the capable one, the person whose approval and knowledge they once disregarded. It was a moment that stirred a cocktail of emotions, disbelief, vindication, and a simmering quiet thrill that things were finally shifting in my favor. I didn't answer immediately. I watched from the shadows, letting their discomfort settle in, observing their hesitations and the subtle way they tried to present themselves as humble or reasonable. The power dynamic had changed, but I was in no rush to reveal it. Years of being underestimated had taught me patience, strategy, and the value of timing. I would not be rushed into forgiveness, nor would I immediately offer my skills. This was no longer about need. I had the upper hand, and I intended to savor it. They began to speak, recounting their problems, trying to frame their desperation in ways that appealed to my sense of reason. "We thought you might be able to help," my father said cautiously, avoiding eye contact. My siblings nodded eagerly, silently reinforcing that I was now in a position they could not command or belittle. The words stung, not because they were polite, but because they revealed the depth of their reliance on me. The truth that my capabilities, once ignored, had become indispensable. Their desperation was a mirror of every moment I had been discounted, and it was intoxicating to witness. I let them talk, letting them fill the room with explanations, justifications, and apologies that were faint and incomplete. I listened to every word, noting tone, hesitation, and unspoken guilt. This was no longer the child who would accept dismissal. This was a grown adult who had built a life through skill, patience, and perseverance. My power was quiet, but absolute. They needed me, and I alone could decide how to respond. The roles had reversed completely, and the realization sent a subtle thrill through me. Yet I did not act immediately. The long game had been my ally from the very beginning, and this was just another stage in that strategy. I could give help, yes, but only on terms I set, only in ways that allowed me to maintain control. Every question, every request, every hesitation from them became information. Their desperation revealed weaknesses, dependencies, and vulnerabilities that had previously been invisible. I began to understand not only what I had gained, but how the tables had turned completely. As they pleaded, subtly flattering, trying to negotiate, I realized the truth. The very family that had once made me feel powerless now needed me. And, in that need, I found the patience to play with restraint, to control the tempo, and to let them experience the uncertainty of waiting. Their prior arrogance had blinded them, and now, for the first time, they were exposed to the reality that I could withhold, delay, or guide assistance according to my own strategy. The contrast between their past rejection and present desperation was almost cinematic. The arrogance, entitlement, and superiority they once wielded so casually had been stripped away by circumstance, leaving them vulnerable, uncertain, and dependent. And while part of me felt a surge of vindication, another part savored the intellectual thrill of the long game. The realization that I could orchestrate outcomes without haste, letting them come to understand the consequences of underestimating me. By the end of the day, I had made a decision. I would help, yes, but carefully, deliberately, and in a way that asserted my control. I would not act out of anger or impulse. I would let time, strategy, and observation guide my moves. This was no longer survival, no longer struggle. It was leverage. And as they left, oblivious to the full extent of my discretion and capability, I felt the quiet satisfaction of power that had been cultivated in shadows, patiently nurtured, and now ready to be exercised when the moment was right. It started with subtle signs, missed payments, delayed shipments, complaints from clients who had once been loyal. The family business, which had always been their crown jewel, began to falter under the weight of incompetence and entitlement. My siblings, once celebrated for charm and natural talent, were suddenly exposed for what they truly were: reckless, overconfident, and unprepared to manage anything of consequence. The contrast was bitterly ironic. The same people who had treated me like an afterthought now found themselves teetering on the edge of collapse. I watched from a distance at first, letting the chaos unfold. Emails went unanswered. Vendors were alienated, profits dropped, and the clients who once praised their competence started expressing doubt. My parents, ever indulgent toward the golden children, were blindsided by the mismanagement, their confidence shaken. Meetings that were once dominated by pomp and certainty devolved into tense arguments, finger-pointing, and defensiveness. The empire of privilege they had built on charm and favoritism was crumbling, and no one seemed capable of stopping it. The irony was not lost on me. For years I had been dismissed, ignored, and ridiculed while they were praised for minimal effort. Now the tables had turned. Their confidence, entitlement, and arrogance, qualities that had overshadowed my quiet perseverance, were failing them spectacularly. They were learning too late that skill, diligence, and foresight could not be replaced by charm or inherited status. And the realization sent a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation coursing through me. I began to assess the damage in detail, cataloging the failures, missteps, and blind spots that had brought the business to this point. It was staggering how predictable the decline had been, once one knew what to look for. Contracts mishandled, key employees alienated, finances mismanaged, opportunities squandered. All of it had been avoidable, yet the family had treated the enterprise as though it could survive on reputation alone. Watching it unravel, I realized that while they had underestimated me, I now had an intimate understanding of both the people and the system that made the business function, or fail. The tipping point came when a major client threatened to sever ties entirely. My siblings panicked, blaming each other and anyone but themselves. The tension in the house was palpable. Years of sibling rivalry and parental favoritism now collided with a harsh reality that demanded competence. I realized then that I held a position of unparalleled leverage. With my skills, insight, and patience, I could step in, stabilize the chaos, and rescue the very enterprise that had once symbolized their superiority, and, in doing so, completely invert the power dynamic that had oppressed me for so long. As I considered my options, a clarity emerged. I could either watch them flounder, letting their mistakes exact their own consequences, or I could intervene strategically, ensuring the business and the wealth it represented passed into the hands of someone who truly deserved to manage it. The idea was intoxicating. The same family that had dismissed my worth was now dependent on the very skills they had once ignored. Every delayed decision, every mismanaged contract, every ignored warning had strengthened my position, positioning me as the unacknowledged linchpin capable of saving or controlling the company. I began quietly preparing, reviewing financial records, understanding client contracts, and mapping the gaps in leadership. The knowledge I had accumulated over years of observation, independent learning, and strategic work outside their sphere of influence suddenly had a clear application. The business teetered on the brink, and I held the keys. It was a rare alignment of opportunity and preparedness, forged from years of exclusion and perseverance. For the first time, the stakes were tangible, the potential consequences immense. The business was not merely an abstract asset. It was a symbol of family power, status, and legacy, all of which had been built on a shaky foundation. And I, the once overlooked black sheep, had become the person whose competence would determine its survival. The irony was exquisite, the potential for satisfaction immense, and the anticipation of the coming shift electrifying. By the end of this realization, I understood a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. For years, my family had undervalued me because they assumed I could never succeed, and now the very survival of their pride and empire rested in my hands. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and I knew that the next moves I made would not only rescue what they had mismanaged, but also cement a reversal of fortune that they could neither ignore nor control. I stepped into the chaos cautiously, yet with a confidence that surprised even me. The family business was on the brink, and the very people who had ridiculed me for years now looked to me for solutions. My first interventions were deliberate, precise, and calculated. I addressed client concerns, corrected financial missteps, and reorganized responsibilities, all while keeping a calm, measured presence. The contrast was immediate: my quiet competence against their floundering confidence, my strategic thinking against their impulsive decisions. The power dynamic, once so skewed against me, was beginning to tilt. At first, my family resisted. My siblings bristled at my suggestions, reluctant to acknowledge that I might have the knowledge and skill they had dismissed for so long. My parents offered hesitant nods, careful not to appear too dependent, though desperation betrayed them. But the situation demanded action, and action required competence, something I possessed in abundance. Every recommendation I made, every problem I solved, revealed the depth of my understanding and the precision of my planning. They began to realize, slowly and uncomfortably, that I was the linchpin holding everything together. The first client I stabilized became the turning point. A shipment that had been delayed for weeks, threatening a lucrative contract, was redirected, managed, and delivered on schedule because of my intervention. My family had worried, panicked, and argued endlessly over it. I acted calmly and efficiently. The gratitude of the client was immediate, the relief palpable. My siblings looked on in stunned silence, as if watching a stranger perform feats they had assumed impossible for me. Their past assumptions of incompetence were crumbling in real time, and I reveled silently in the reversal of perception. It wasn't just about business operations, it was about authority. Every decision I made carried weight because it produced results. Every solution I proposed was met with outcomes that validated my insight. Slowly, my family stopped interrupting, stopped questioning, and began deferring to my judgment. My parents, who had once dismissed me as timid and ineffectual, began to rely on me. My siblings, who had always flaunted entitlement, started to recognize the quiet authority I had cultivated over years of preparation and observation. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The once dismissed black sheep was becoming the indispensable leader. I maintained patience, never flaunting my power or rushing their acknowledgement. My silence, my previously overlooked presence, became a tool. I allowed them to see the results of their reliance without asserting dominance overtly. They had been taught to undervalue me, but now in every correction, every strategic decision, and every successful intervention, the evidence of my competence was undeniable. Authority emerged naturally from effectiveness, not from declarations. Each day reinforced the power shift. Meetings that had once been dominated by my siblings' brash voices now followed my agenda. Tasks previously ignored or mishandled were executed efficiently under my guidance. Clients and vendors, once skeptical of the family's management, began expressing trust and appreciation for the solutions I implemented. And while my family's pride made acknowledgement awkward, their dependence was undeniable. The quiet tension between past dismissal and present reliance became palpable, a living testament to the reversal of roles. The suspense of this transformation was electrifying. I could feel the gravity of every decision, the anticipation in the air as my family adapted to the reality that I was no longer invisible. Their previous arrogance, once a barrier to my growth, now underscored the depth of my rise. With every action, every result, and every subtle assertion of competence, I reinforced the shift of power, demonstrating that authority does not demand permission, it earns it. By the end of the week, the change was clear. My suggestions were implemented without debate, my strategies relied upon without hesitation. I had moved from outsider to indispensable authority, and the realization left my family both unsettled and begrudgingly grateful. The silent observer of years past had transformed into the decisive, competent leader, and the echoes of past ridicule only amplified the satisfaction of the moment. I understood then that power, once denied, is sweetest when claimed through patience, preparation, and precision. My long years of observation, resilience, and strategic thinking had culminated in this moment, a shift so complete that my family could no longer deny the change. The black sheep had become the backbone, the strategist, the authority. And this was only the beginning of the full reclamation of control that had been quietly building for years. The moment I realized how indispensable I had become was intoxicating. Meetings that had once been arenas for my siblings' entitlement now followed my lead. Decisions that had been mishandled, budgets that had been ignored, and projects that had floundered were suddenly executed with precision under my guidance. I had become the center of the family business, the one everyone, reluctantly or not, depended on. The irony was almost sweet. The same people who had dismissed me as incapable were now powerless without my expertise. My siblings hated it. I could see it in the way they avoided eye contact, muttered under their breath, or attempted to assert authority, and were gently but firmly corrected. Their pride bristled at every suggestion I made, yet they could not dispute the outcomes. Every success I engineered reinforced the truth they could no longer deny. Competence mattered more than charm, skill outweighed entitlement, and I had both in abundance. Their resentment was a silent soundtrack to my quiet triumph. I maintained calm authority. I did not boast or flaunt, but every decision I made, every problem I solved, was a demonstration of the power I now wielded. The control I had once only imagined became real and operational. Clients praised our turnaround, employees respected the clarity and structure I provided, and even vendors began to see the family business as a well-managed enterprise again. The results were tangible, undeniable, and entirely guided by the person they had once scorned. The contrast between my past and present was staggering. I had gone from being the invisible child, silenced and overlooked, to the strategist orchestrating outcomes, dictating direction, and securing the family's financial stability. Their previous attempts to diminish me had only strengthened my ability to rise. Every insult, every slight, every moment of dismissal had been converted into experience, knowledge, and resilience. The black sheep had become the shepherd, quietly guiding the very flock that had rejected me. There was a subtle thrill in this power. I could sense the tension each time I walked into a room, the reluctant deference of my siblings, and the quiet gratitude of my parents, who could no longer ignore my value. Each meeting, each completed project, each restored client relationship reinforced my position. The family's arrogance, once suffocating, now highlighted the depth of my ascent. I had transformed invisibility and exclusion into leverage, crafting authority from years of preparation and patience. Yet, I was careful. This power was not a weapon to wield recklessly. My approach was deliberate, strategic. I allowed my siblings' resentment to simmer quietly, understanding that their pride would be a tool, not a threat. I guided, corrected, and managed, letting results speak louder than words. The shift in power was complete, but the full effect, the ultimate reversal, was still being planned. I had tasted control, and it was sweeter for having been denied for so long. The family business had become a proving ground, a stage where competence, diligence, and strategy triumphed over entitlement and favoritism. Each success reinforced the truth. I was the backbone, the engine driving stability and growth, and they were reliant upon my vision. The thrill of quiet authority was not just in the outcomes, but in the knowledge that their dependence was earned. Through patience and skill, not fear or obligation. In private moments, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From invisibility to empowerment, from humiliation to command, from being dismissed to becoming essential. The taste of control was intoxicating, not because of vengeance alone, but because it represented validation, mastery, and a reclamation of every opportunity they had once denied me. I had transformed their dismissal into leverage, their neglect into preparation, and their scorn into proof of my strength. As the weeks passed, the family adapted reluctantly to the new dynamic. My siblings were still resentful, still attempting subtle challenges, yet every attempt failed against my strategic guidance. The more they resisted, the more the contrast between their impotence and my capability became apparent. I had become not only indispensable but unassailable within the structure of the business. Their past superiority now seemed fragile and illusory. And in the quiet moments, I allowed myself to savor the inevitability of the next phase. The taste of control was not final, it was preparation. I had established authority, demonstrated competence, and inverted the power structure entirely. Now, with patience and strategy on my side, I could prepare for the ultimate move, the moment when the black sheep would not only lead, but claim a legacy that had once been denied. The stage was set, the pieces in motion, and the family, once so blind, was finally learning what it meant to depend on me. It was time to let the truth speak for itself. Months of careful observation, meticulous record-keeping, and strategic patience had given me the clarity to see the full scope of my siblings' mismanagement. The waste, the incompetence, the misappropriation of funds. It was all there, hidden beneath layers of entitlement and charm. What had once been subtle, easily ignored or dismissed, was now concrete, undeniable evidence. I began compiling reports, tracking patterns and connecting the dots, revealing the rotten core that had brought the family business to the brink. The moment of revelation was quiet, but impactful. I presented facts, numbers, and examples in a calm, authoritative tone, leaving no room for argument. Mismanaged budgets, ignored contracts, and reckless decisions became visible for everyone to see. My siblings' confident facades crumbled under the weight of evidence. Their denials, excuses, and attempts to shift blame fell flat against the clarity of documented truth. For once, their mistakes were no longer invisible. They were exposed, undeniable, and inescapable. Parents, previously blind to favoritism and mismanagement, were forced to confront reality. Every question they had ever ignored, every subtle complaint they had brushed aside, now demanded acknowledgement. The contrast was striking. The same family who once ignored my competence now witnessed their own failures laid bare by the very person they had belittled. It was justice of the quiet, strategic kind, the kind that could not be undone, argued, away, or dismissed. I observed my siblings' reactions carefully. Shock, embarrassment, defensiveness, all visible in gestures, tone, and eyes. Their previous arrogance, built on assumptions of superiority, collapsed as they realized that their mismanagement was not only documented, but undeniable. Each revelation was a mirror, reflecting their failures in stark relief against my competence. The irony was exquisite. The black sheep, once silenced and invisible, had become the arbiter of truth, exposing the very flaws that had been hidden by pride and entitlement. This was more than just professional correction. It was moral vindication. Every humiliation, every overlooked achievement, every slight from the past had prepared me to confront this moment with precision and clarity. Justice, long delayed, was unfolding in real time. My family's assumptions about my incapacity, incompetence, and irrelevance were shattered, replaced by the undeniable reality of my authority and insight. Their dependence on me was now coupled with the sobering recognition that they had relied on the wrong people for far too long. As I revealed the layers of corruption and mismanagement, a shift occurred in the room. My parents, initially hesitant and cautious, began to defer entirely to my judgment. My siblings, once bold and unchallenged, were reduced to silent acknowledgement. their influence waning as I stepped fully into the role of decision-maker. The authority I had cultivated in silence and patience now had tangible impact. I was not only competent, but indispensable, and the evidence of their failings only reinforced the trust placed in me. The exposure of the rotten core also strengthened my own position. By revealing the truth without emotion or malice, I positioned myself as the only trustworthy leader. Competence and fairness, once invisible to my family, were now undeniable. My siblings' mistakes were no longer speculative. They were documented, unavoidable, and irreversible. And in that moment, the power that had been denied to me for years became absolute, resting not on anger or revenge, but on clarity, evidence, and strategic patience. Even as the shock settled, I maintained composure. There was no need for grand gestures or humiliation. The facts had spoken. The consequences were already unfolding. Employees, clients, and stakeholders saw the resolution of mismanagement and responded with trust and confidence. The business stabilized, but the lesson was clear. Authority is earned through competence, not favoritism, and the black sheep who had been ignored for years had emerged as the only reliable steward of the enterprise. By the end of the day, the transformation was undeniable. My siblings' incompetence had been exposed, my parents' reliance had shifted, and my authority was cemented. The rotten core, once hidden beneath privilege and charm, was visible to all, and as I looked around the room, I recognized the culmination of years of patience, strategy, and resilience. I had turned neglect into power, exclusion into influence, and humiliation into authority. I was no longer the overlooked one. I was the leader, the guide, and the final arbiter of the family's legacy. The stage was now set for the final acts. With the truth laid bare, my position was unassailable. I had earned control through observation, strategy, and action, and the only remaining steps were to consolidate it fully and ensure that the family business, and the respect it commanded, rested entirely in the hands of someone who had earned it. Me. It was inevitable that my siblings would attempt one last desperate move. Years of entitlement and arrogance had convinced them that they could challenge me, even now, when the tide had turned. They underestimated the depth of my preparation, the precision of my strategy, and the patience I had cultivated in silence. Their plan was subtle at first: a misrepresented financial report, an attempt to sway a client, an offhand comment designed to undermine my authority. But I had anticipated it, predicted it, and was ready. When the first signs appeared, I did not react immediately. I observed quietly, noting patterns, timing, and intent. The attempt to sabotage me became almost comical as each misstep unfolded. What they thought was deception and cunning was exposed as recklessness and desperation. Every whisper, every manipulated detail, every attempt to sway opinion against me revealed their ignorance of how thoroughly I had prepared for this moment. They had no idea that the very skills they had scorned were now their undoing. I allowed the situation to escalate just enough to reveal the full extent of their actions. A client questioned a decision, a vendor hesitated, and the siblings' attempts to shift blame began to unravel. Slowly, methodically, I intervened, not to punish, but to correct, stabilize, and document. Each action I took highlighted their incompetence and dependence, transforming their betrayal into proof of my own capability. The irony was exquisite. The betrayal they had once wielded against me was now weaponized, reflecting back on them with precision. My parents, once blind to favoritism, were forced to confront the truth yet again. The facade my siblings had tried to maintain crumbled, and the contrast between my composure and their desperation could not have been more apparent. Where they had attempted chaos, I restored order. Where they had tried deception, I applied transparency. The room, once tense with covert sabotage, shifted to clarity and authority. My family's final act of defiance became a stage for my ultimate control. I didn't need to escalate beyond strategy. Every correction, every adjustment, every transparent action reinforced my position. Clients and employees began seeing the contrast between my steady hand and my siblings' floundering efforts. The final betrayal, intended to destabilize me, instead solidified my leadership. Their failure to anticipate my foresight, patience, and expertise left them powerless in the face of consequences they had brought upon themselves. The satisfaction was profound. Years of exclusion, ridicule, and dismissal had culminated in this moment of reversal. The very tactics used against me were mirrored back, exposing incompetence, entitlement, and poor judgment. I had learned from every slight, every mockery, every dismissal, and now those lessons were being applied with precision. Betrayal, once a source of pain, had become a tool, one that highlighted my resilience and cemented my authority. By the end of the week, the fallout was clear. My siblings' credibility had taken a hit they could not recover from. Clients and stakeholders were aligned with my direction, and the business ran smoother under my guidance than ever before. The final attempt to destabilize me had failed, spectacularly, and in its failure, my position was unassailable. Every action, every decision, every success underscored the reversal of fortune. The once powerless black sheep now commanded the enterprise with authority and precision. The emotional catharsis was unlike anything I had experienced before. Every humiliation endured in the past, the dinners ignored, the birthdays forgotten, the projects mocked, was vindicated in this moment. Their betrayal, which had once wounded me deeply, had been transformed into a lesson in patience, strategy, and ultimate triumph. The sense of justice was not loud or vengeful. It was quiet, methodical, and undeniable. I had turned every act of cruelty into an instrument of empowerment. With the final betrayal neutralized, the path forward was clear. The business, once a battleground, was now firmly under my guidance. Authority, respect, and trust had been earned, and every attempt to challenge it had only reinforced my position. The long years of exclusion, silence, and observation had culminated in this perfect reversal of roles. They had tried to undermine me, and instead, they had elevated me. I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the irony. The family who had dismissed me, mocked me, and undervalued me had unwittingly paved the way for my dominance. Their final act of sabotage was not a setback. It was the last piece of proof that I was ready, capable, and unassailable. The black sheep, once powerless and ignored, had mastered the art of control, and nothing could shake the position I had earned through patience, strategy, and unwavering determination. The moment I signed the final papers, a surreal calm settled over me. After years of invisibility, neglect, and ridicule, the family business, once a symbol of their pride and my exclusion, was officially mine. The weight of authority was tangible in my hands, a stark contrast to the years I had spent, watching from the shadows, dismissed and underestimated. I was no longer the overlooked child. I was the one in charge, the architect of the enterprise, the person whose judgment, skill, and perseverance now dictated the course of the company. The irony was delicious. My siblings, who had once paraded their charm and entitlement as proof of superiority, now looked to me with a mixture of resentment, disbelief, and begrudging respect. Their laughter at my perceived incompetence had been silenced by the quiet, unstoppable momentum of preparation and resilience. Every mistake they had made, every opportunity squandered, and every moment of dismissal they had inflicted on me had been converted into the foundation of my authority. I was finally in the position that had been denied to me for so long, and the contrast between past humiliation and present triumph was breathtaking. My parents, who had once measured worth through favoritism, now watched as I assumed control. The pride they had once reserved for my siblings was redirected, reluctant but undeniable, toward me. They could no longer dismiss my capability or diminish my accomplishments. The evidence was concrete, public, and unassailable. The family dynamic had been inverted. Authority, respect, and control, all things they had withheld, were now mine. The black sheep, silenced for so long, had become the steward of the legacy they had once hoarded. Every decision I made from that moment carried weight, not just operationally, but symbolically. The business was no longer merely a source of income or status for the family. It was a testament to perseverance, intelligence, and patience. Employees, clients, and stakeholders responded with trust and enthusiasm, recognizing the clarity, strategy, and vision I brought to the company. The contrast was stark. Once dismissed as worthless, now indispensable. Once ignored, now respected. Once powerless, now in command. But triumph alone was not the end of the story. I understood that ownership carried responsibility, not just over finances and operations, but over the relationships, the culture, and the legacy of the business. Revenge had its place in the satisfaction of justice, but control, true control, required vision, fairness, and discernment. My role was not to crush my siblings entirely, but to guide, correct, and elevate where possible, while ensuring that the lessons of past neglect and mismanagement were neither forgotten nor repeated. As I walked through the offices, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Colleagues who had once hesitated to acknowledge me now sought guidance and reassurance. Their confidence mirrored the change I had orchestrated, reinforcing the fact that authority earned through competence resonates deeper than inherited entitlement. Every interaction, every decision, every strategy implemented was both a personal triumph and a validation of the journey that had brought me here. There was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the faces of my siblings, their expressions a mix of grudging acknowledgement and stunned recognition. They had underestimated me for years, laughed at my ambition, and assumed my efforts would amount to nothing. Yet here I stood, the one shaping the future, the one holding the reins, the one who had transformed exclusion and humiliation into unassailable power. The contrast between past scorn and present authority was not just satisfying, it was transformative. I reflected on the long journey that had led to this moment. From being invisible at family dinners, dismissed in every endeavor, and laughed at for my efforts, to becoming the decisive force steering the business. Every small humiliation, every act of neglect, every slight from those who should have supported me had fueled my resilience, honed my skills, and strengthened my resolve. Ownership was not simply a legal title, it was the culmination of every lesson learned in silence, every strategy executed in the shadows, every moment of patience and perseverance. And yet, I knew that the story was bigger than revenge. The triumph of ownership was satisfying, but it was also a platform for something greater. I now had the power to shape not only the business, but the culture, the standards, and the legacy that would endure. Triumph, yes, but also responsibility, vision, and the ability to create something that reflected my values and my journey. The black sheep had claimed the throne, but the reign would be defined not by vengeance alone, but by intelligence, patience, and integrity. As the ink dried on the final documents and the weight of authority settled fully upon me, I realized that this was the moment every struggle, every slight, and every humiliation had been preparing me for. The contrast between who I had been and who I had become could not be more profound. I had claimed what was once denied, but the journey was far from over. Ownership was the threshold, and beyond it lay the full realization of vision, control, and legacy. For years, I had defined family by blood, by the household I grew up in, by the people who had ignored, dismissed, and humiliated me. But now, as I held the reins of the family business and wielded the authority I had fought so long to claim, I realized that family was not solely about genetics or shared history. It was about support, trust, and shared values. The people I chose to surround myself with became my true family. Friends who had stood by me, employees who respected my vision, and mentors who had guided me through the trials I faced alone. The sense of belonging that had been denied to me in childhood was slowly reclaimed in these chosen connections. Meetings with loyal employees were not just about business. They were about collaboration, respect, and mutual empowerment. Conversations with mentors reinforced lessons learned from past mistakes and strengthened my confidence to lead decisively. Even friends, who had once been outside the sphere of family influence, became pillars of encouragement, reminding me that trust and love could exist beyond the home where I had once felt invisible. The contrast was profound, the suffocating rejection of my early years versus the genuine connection and recognition I now experienced. I made a conscious decision to nurture this network, understanding that these chosen relationships were not temporary fixes, but essential components of my life. I celebrated achievements together, shared challenges openly, and cultivated a culture where every voice mattered. The warmth, respect, and loyalty I received in return were the antithesis of the conditional love and favoritism that had shaped my upbringing. Each interaction became a lesson in belonging, each shared success a reinforcement that family could be built through choice, not obligation. The emotional healing this provided was immense. I could finally release the lingering pain from years of neglect and exclusion. The quiet victories I had accumulated, the reclamation of authority, the exposure of past betrayal, the triumph over systemic favoritism, were no longer solely personal milestones. They became shared achievements with people who genuinely cared. The relief of being seen, valued, and supported was intoxicating, a counterbalance to the loneliness that had accompanied my early successes. At the same time, my chosen family became a mirror, reflecting what true loyalty, trust, and care could feel like. Their belief in me reinforced my own self-worth, validating the resilience, patience, and intelligence that had brought me to this point. Unlike the family of my youth, where love was conditional and attention selective, this network provided consistent support and mutual respect. The contrast was clear and healing. Where I had once been invisible, I was now integral, valued, and celebrated. Through this redefinition of family, I also learned to forgive, not to forget, but to release the hold of past hurt on my present. I acknowledged the role my birth family had played in shaping my resilience, yet I no longer allowed their neglect to dictate my happiness or self-worth. The empowerment I had cultivated through business success and strategic patience was now complemented by emotional fulfillment, a sense of belonging that had been denied for so long. Every day, as I engaged with this chosen family, I was reminded that trust and loyalty could be cultivated through respect and shared purpose. Birthright and favoritism were meaningless compared to earned respect and mutual support. The lessons from my past, painful as they were, had guided me to build relationships that were authentic, sustaining, and deeply enriching. In these connections, I discovered that true family is not a matter of blood, but of heart, effort, and shared values. I also observed the subtle impact this had on my siblings and parents. They were witnesses now to the fulfillment and satisfaction that came not from authority alone, but from meaningful connection and support. While they remained a part of my world, I no longer relied on their approval or validation. My sense of belonging, my emotional security, and my peace were rooted in those who had earned it, not those who had withheld it. By cultivating this chosen family, I completed a cycle that had begun in childhood, the search for recognition, support, and belonging. Only now, unlike in the past, the effort was mutual, genuine, and deeply rewarding. I had transformed my experience of exclusion into the foundation for inclusion, my past pain into a guide for creating authentic bonds. Healing, I realized, came not from revenge alone, but from surrounding oneself with people who saw, valued, and uplifted you. And as I looked around at this network of friends, employees, and mentors, people who had become my family by choice, I felt a profound sense of closure and peace. The story of neglect, favoritism, and betrayal was no longer a chain but a lesson, one that had guided me to strength, empowerment, and a redefined sense of family. The stage was set for the final act, not as a moment of vengeance, but as a culmination of resilience, growth, and emotional fulfillment. As I sit in my office, overlooking the empire I've built from patience, strategy, and resilience, I finally understand what closure truly means. It is not about vengeance for the sake of cruelty, nor about proving others wrong to satisfy pride. It is about reclaiming what was denied, owning your worth, and defining your own path. The family that once dismissed me, mocked me, and ignored me no longer dictates my sense of value or direction. I am free from the chains of expectation and neglect, and the journey that began in invisibility has brought me to clarity and empowerment. Revenge, in the traditional sense, might have been satisfying in the short term, but my version of closure was far more profound. It was the slow, deliberate reclamation of authority, competence, and dignity. Each small humiliation endured as a child became a lesson in patience. Each act of exclusion taught me observation and strategy. Each dismissive word fueled the determination that now guides every decision I make. Closure was not destruction of others. It was the restoration of myself, the assertion of my own worth, and the creation of a life defined by my choices rather than their judgments. I reflect on my parents' and siblings' reactions throughout this journey. The astonishment, the begrudging respect, the uncomfortable acknowledgement of my authority, it was all secondary to the truth I had discovered about myself. Their approval, once so coveted, no longer holds sway. I do not need to be celebrated or validated by them. I have earned my recognition through action, perseverance, and integrity. The silence that once protected me from humiliation has transformed into quiet confidence, the kind that commands respect without requiring applause. There is a bittersweet aspect to this empowerment. I do not dwell on the pain or the injustices suffered, but I acknowledge them as essential to my growth. Each scar, each overlooked effort, and each sting of rejection contributed to the resilience I now embody. The emotional weight of those experiences has not disappeared. It has been transformed into strength, insight, and clarity. Where once I felt powerless and unseen, I now move with purpose, authority, and a profound understanding of my own value. In reclaiming the family business, I have also reclaimed a part of my identity that had been denied for so long. I am no longer defined by their favoritism, their scorn, or their expectations. I am defined by my vision, my competence, and the choices I have made to build a life on my own terms. The black sheep, once overlooked, has become the shepherd, guiding not only the enterprise but also the lessons and legacy that will endure beyond me. There is power in this transformation, but also peace, a recognition that my journey was never about them, but about becoming who I was always capable of being. The friendships, mentorships, and chosen family I have cultivated reinforce this truth. Belonging, trust, and support now exist in a sphere I control, nurtured by mutual respect and shared values rather than bloodlines or obligation. I am surrounded by people who see me, who value my insight, and who celebrate accomplishments without conditions. This network, built from intention and authenticity, amplifies the closure I feel, the knowledge that I am no longer dependent on anyone who once diminished me and that my destiny is truly my own. I think back to the moments of humiliation, the birthdays ignored, the projects dismissed, and the whispered criticisms that once haunted me. Those moments no longer sting. They serve as reminders of how far I have come. The injustices of the past are no longer weights, but markers of progress, evidence of lessons learned, and proof of resilience. Each act of exclusion was a stepping stone, each slight a lesson in strategy, and each insult a catalyst for growth. In this perspective, closure is not erasure of the past, but the integration of experience into the narrative of self-mastery and empowerment. There is a strange serenity in knowing that I no longer seek validation from those who once withheld it. I am the author of my own story, the architect of my own success, and the steward of my own legacy. Every decision, every strategy, and every success is a testament to the journey from invisibility to authority, from dismissal to respect, from exclusion to empowerment. The family who once seemed untouchable in their favoritism and pride has been rendered secondary to the life I have built, with deliberate intention and unwavering focus. As I look forward, I do so with clarity, rather than vengeance. The triumph is not in punishing others, but in proving to myself that I am capable, resourceful, and resilient. I have turned humiliation into insight, neglect into preparation, and scorn into strategy. The power I hold is not just financial or operational. It is the power of self-definition, of autonomy, and of knowing my worth beyond external recognition. This is the essence of closure, the internal liberation that comes from mastering one's own narrative. In the quiet moments, I allow myself to feel the full weight of transformation. The child who once faded into the background, silenced and overlooked, has become the leader, the strategist, and the guardian of legacy. The pain endured was never wasted. It was the foundation upon which I built authority, wisdom, and resilience. The black sheep has become the shepherd, and the journey from invisibility to empowerment is complete. I am whole, I am in control, and I am free.